We've all had the experience of our morning alarm clock seamlessly blending into a dream right before we wake up. But what happens when the real-world sound invading your nightmare is actually someone trying to break into your house? A man living alone was in the middle of the most disturbing nightmare of his life. In the dream, he was lying in his own bed when a violent, echoing bang came from downstairs. The dream forced him to get up and investigate. He wandered through his pitch-black house, following the heavy sound. The windows in the dream were completely blacked out, replaced by an unsettling void of nothingness. The loud, rhythmic banging led him up to his attic door. He slowly opened it. Standing in the dark attic was a terrifying, pale old woman. She was rhythmically slamming her rotting hand down onto a wooden box. When she noticed him, she turned around, opened her mouth to an impossible, inhuman width, and lunged violently at his face. He jolted awake in a cold sweat. His chest was heaving. He tried to calm down, telling himself it was just a terrible nightmare. Then, in the dead silence of his real bedroom, he heard it. Bang! It was the exact same heavy, violent sound from his dream, and it was coming from downstairs. His heart completely dropped into his stomach. He quietly crept out of bed, grabbed a heavy butcher knife from the kitchen block, and crouched low behind his front door. The sound wasn't a polite knock. It was the aggressive, forceful pounding of someone actively trying to kick the heavy wooden door off its hinges. He waited in agonizing silence for a full minute, gripping the knife. Finally, he gathered the courage to peek through the side window. Standing at the end of his driveway in the pitch black was a tall man dressed in dark clothing. The man stared at the house for a moment before silently walking away down the street. The terrifying reality was that a violent intruder had been trying to bash his door in at 4 a.m., and his sleeping brain had perfectly incorporated the violent sounds into his nightmare instead of immediately waking him up. Sometimes, a dream feels less like a random hallucination and more like a deeply unsettling premonition. A young man was having a nightmare where the power in his house had suddenly been cut. In the dream logic, he went down to the dark basement to check the fuse box. When he opened the metal panel, there was a single neon yellow sticky note inside. Written in jagged handwriting were the words, "Go back upstairs to the red room." While still in the basement, he began hearing a low, agonizing moan coming from the boiler room. The heavy metal door slowly cracked open, and a terrifying, deformed head poked out, staring at him from the darkness. Panicking, he fled the basement and followed the note's instructions, running up to the second floor. At the very end of his hallway, where there should have been a blank wall, was a glowing, bright red door. As he approached, he heard a deeply disturbing, echoing voice chanting a rhythmic sequence of numbers from behind the wood. 3, 14, 3, 14. He slowly turned the knob and pushed the glowing door open. The room was bathed in a suffocating red light. There was nothing inside except a single wooden chair facing the corner. The voice grew deafeningly loud, sounding as if a sinister presence was whispering directly into his physical ear. 3, 14. He woke up with a violent gasp, his heart hammering in his chest. The room was dark and quiet. Trying to shake off the extreme dread, he reached over to his nightstand and tapped his iPhone screen to check the time. The bright digital numbers on the screen glared back at him in the darkness. It was exactly 3:14 a.m. There were no other digital or analog clocks anywhere in his bedroom. To this day, he has absolutely no idea how his sleeping brain knew the exact, precise minute of the night or what dark entity was waiting for him inside that glowing red room. A forum user named Joey Mancuso explicitly prefaced his story by stating he is a strict atheist who doesn't believe in the supernatural, miracles, or any higher powers. Yet, an experience he had years ago still leaves him completely without a logical explanation. Joey was having a chaotic nightmare. He was walking through a strange, constantly shifting house. The rooms were rapidly changing colors and layouts. Eventually, he found himself standing in a large, empty upstairs room. Hanging on the wall in front of him was an impossibly massive framed portrait. It was at least 20 feet high. The painting was a highly realistic portrait of his 30-year-old cousin, a woman he hadn't spoken to or seen in several years. The painting was deeply unnerving. Her eyes were enlarged to an uncomfortable, bulging size, and the painted pupils physically moved, following him wherever he walked in the room. Suddenly, a massive crack split the center of the painting. The deafening, rusty shriek of heavy iron nails ripping out of the drywall filled Joey's ears. The giant portrait detached from the wall and plummeted directly toward him, threatening to crush his entire body. Just before the heavy frame smashed into his face, Joey jolted awake. He was breathing heavily in his bed. It was around 5 a.m. He wiped the sweat from his forehead, trying to calm his racing heart. Less than 2 minutes after waking up, the loud ringing of his cell phone shattered the silence of his dark bedroom. He picked it up. It was his uncle. His uncle was crying uncontrollably. He had called to tell Joey that his 30-year-old cousin, the exact same woman from the giant crushing portrait, had just suffered a massive heroin overdose and died. When you lose conscious control of your body during a nightmare, the results can be terrifying for the people sleeping around you. A father named Earl Feinhardt had collapsed into bed after an incredibly long, stressful day. Deep into the night, a highly disturbing dream began to fade in. Earl found himself standing alone in the dark, dense woods outside of a massive, imposing black castle. The sky above was a sickening shade of deep blue. Suddenly, a horrific, demonic voice began echoing from deep inside the castle walls. It sounded like it was actively calling his name, pulling him forward. Earl realized he had no lucid control over his dream body. He was physically forced to walk toward the structure. The castle had no doors, just dark, open archways. As he walked deeper into the stone corridors, the hallways became impossibly narrow. The demonic screaming grew louder and closer. Earl felt his dream body violently banging against the narrow stone walls as he dragged himself toward a dark room on his left. He stepped into the pitch-black room, desperately trying to reach the source of the horrific screaming. He physically bumped into something hard in the dark. Instantly, Earl woke up, but he wasn't in his bed. He was standing in the pitch dark of his house. He looked down. He was hunched aggressively over his 4-year-old son's bed. His little boy was huddled in the corner of his mattress, screaming and crying in absolute terror. His son had woken up from a bad dream, only to see his father's tall silhouette slowly walk into his dark room, violently banging his shoulders against the doorframe, before stopping right at the edge of the bed and slowly looming over him like a monster. Earl had physically acted out his demonic nightmare, terrifying his son in the process. During the summer of 2015, a high schooler returned home late from a party, heavily under the influence of marijuana. Exhausted, he managed to sneak past his parents and crash onto his bed, falling asleep in less than 10 minutes. His chemically altered sleep produced a hyper-realistic, terrifying nightmare. He was trapped in the middle of a dark, dead forest. Instead of crickets, the air was filled with the ghostly howling of wolves and the distinct, heavy sound of boots crunching on twigs directly behind him. He was being hunted. He ran blindly through the trees until he stumbled upon an abandoned house. He ran inside and barricaded the front door. The house was completely stripped of color. Everything was entirely black and white. He sat in the dark living room, listening in horror as the heavy footsteps slowly circled the exterior of the house. Suddenly, a dark, human-shaped shadow appeared outside the living room window. A second later, a loud, aggressive knock, knock, knock echoed against the glass. The figure kept aggressively knocking on the window pane. It wouldn't stop. The panic in the dream became unbearable, forcing the teenager to jolt awake in his bed. He lay in the dark, his heart pounding. The nightmare was over. But the loud, aggressive knocking didn't stop. Knock, knock, knock. He shot up in bed and stared at his actual bedroom window. Standing right on the other side of the glass staring directly into his room in the dead of night, was a dark, shadowy figure, forcefully tapping on the glass. The teenager let out a terrified scream for his father. The shadow at the window instantly ducked down and sprinted away into the darkness of the yard. His father rushed in with a flashlight and searched the property, finding nothing. He told his son it was just a bad dream and a hallucination. But the teenager knows the terrifying truth. The sound of the knocking in his dream was completely real. Someone had been watching him sleep.